Alastrom, There Is No War in Space, by C.W. Kilburn. Chapter 1. He was swallowed by a deafening rush of freezing air as the red glow of tracer fire arced through the night sky above. The primary failed, and the free fall through icy darkness continued. Burke kept time in his head. The secondary successfully deployed at the envelope's edge of the margin for error. He would be off course now, with less than 12 hours to retrieve the package. Burke touched down in a wide, pungent marsh, clothed in islands of razor-sharp sawgrass. The muck there was nearly hip-deep, and he was lucky not to break his legs. Using some of the tangled lines, he was able to pull himself free. There was no need to bury the silk. Rotary-winged aircraft appeared in the night sky. Burke had not seen any like them before. Their searchlights methodically scanned the perimeter of the broad marsh, while large numbers of vehicles arrived along a road there. Rapidly, Burke was surrounded on three sides by heavily armed law enforcement and ocean at his back. His instincts and training urged him to hide in the tall grass, to evade and escape, but those weren't his orders. When they took Burke down, they took him down hard. It was partly his fault. He worked his way too close under cover of darkness before anyone got eyes on him. He was busy eating dirt for a while as a big cop spewed vulgarities and pressed his heavy knee against the back of Burke's neck. Eventually, a gaggle of officers cuffed Burke and put him in the backseat of a patrol car. An armored personnel carrier quickly arrived. Heavily armed soldiers wearing masks and tactical gear spilled out and surrounded the patrol car. A military official of some rank had a sidebar with the cops and then gave his team the go-ahead. Burke was taken by soldiers at gunpoint and transferred into the APC. They were quickly on the move, and each soldier silently spied Burke suspiciously from behind their masks. He was mud-stained and barefooted, averting his eyes. The vehicle traveled for some time, and when it came to a stop, they covered Burke's head with a musty black hood. The motorized rear door opened, and the strong odors of diesel and avgas penetrated the fibers of the stale sack. Idling aircraft propellers roared in their revolutions, and the entire atmosphere of the place seemed to vibrate. They took Burke aboard one of the larger ones. He was strapped into a seat and his legs shackled. After the acceleration of takeoff and press of the ascent, Burke sensed the oversized aircraft level off. Someone approached him. A dull pain in his neck, an injection. Within a matter of seconds, Burke's entire body was gamely warming towards the inevitability of unconsciousness. Hearing loss was followed by paralysis before he finally succumbed. When he emerged from the fog of it, Burke found himself in a strange room. His eyesight was blurry, but he counted 8 equal walls, distributed to form a proper octagon. The walls, floor, and ceiling of the room were composed entirely of polished stainless steel. Powerful lights were recessed into the steel-plated ceiling. The intensity of the lights reflected off the shiny metal components and cooked the room in searing brightness. As Burke came around and his eyes completely adjusted, he knew instinctively that one of the walls was different from the others. The facing wall reflected the already intense light a bit more intensely. He assumed that it was a two-way mirror, or maybe a display screen. Burke was seated in the center of the room facing the wall screen. At his wrists, chromed cuffs linked him to a heavy eyelet embedded in a steel table. His legs were shackled to a steel chair, which was in turn bolted to the floor. He was still wearing only the anonymous white jumpsuit, but no one could call it white anymore. It had been stained in its entirety with black mud and road dirt. His bare hands, feet, and face were smeared with it too. As Burke focused on the time elapsed since deployment, a disembodied voice spoke. "Identify yourself." Burke was silent. The voice repeated, "Identify yourself." Burke did not respond. There was some delay, and then the voice spoke again. "You're suspected of violating sovereign national airspace. Identify yourself." Burke remained silent. The lights were switched off and the room went black. There was silence for a moment, and then the barometric pressure in the room seemingly changed. Burke felt his ears pop just before a bright strobe penetrated the darkness, pulsating rapidly. A strange, low-frequency hum began to fill his chest, and its pressure grew increasingly stronger. Burke fought against it. He would not look at the flickering light. He focused his mind. He kept time in his head. He fought against it. He would not accept a suggestion. Ultimately, the pulsating strobe and low-frequency hum ceased, and the space once again grew dark, cold, and silent. Burke could roughly account for 3 hours since deployment, not knowing exactly how long he had been unconscious. The disembodied voice returned from the darkness. "Identify yourself." Burke did not speak. The blinding bright light switched on again. Burke had no way to shield his eyes other than to close them tightly. An unimaginable and malicious force pushed through the back of his head. He struggled to endure wave after wave of agony. And as each new wave of electrically charged pain approached, Burke squeezed the air in his lungs like a fighter pilot, forcing blood to his head to prevent blackout. Because of his training and his own fierce will, he overcame it. The disembodied voice again demanded, "Identify yourself." Burke did not speak. He focused on his breathing. He kept time in his head. Several minutes later, there was a sound like compressed air escaping from an open valve. A hidden door opened in one of the walls. A well-groomed man wearing thick-framed glasses and a freshly pressed suit came through the opening carrying an attaché case. The secret door immediately melted back into the wall behind him. The man approached the table. A cast concrete stool rose from the floor opposite of Burke. The man perched on the stool and removed a tablet computer from the attaché he was carrying. He placed it on the table and read silently over some digital files. Finally, the man in the suit spoke.
"Since you refuse to speak with us, I'm going to speak to you for a little while."
Burke, his face covered in dried mud, dismissively looked away. The man in the suit read aloud from a document in the file.
At approximately 1800 hours, the Adobe Airfield radar installation began tracking an unknown aircraft that was not squawking a transponder signal. Several attempts by base personnel to establish radio contact with said aircraft were ignored. Military radar continued to track the unknown aircraft, and military personnel utilizing various platforms were dispatched to intercept and destroy said aircraft. After it was engaged, the unknown aircraft disappeared from radar, and a parachute was observed by ground-based law enforcement officers near the unknown aircraft's last radar contact position. One unsub, that's you, was consequently taken into custody by local LEO before being released to the proper military authority. This incursion into sovereign national airspace is a violation of national and international law. Those convicted of such an incursion face severe penalties under the law.
"You're a lawyer," Burke said, his eyes still averted.
"So you can speak."
Burke didn't respond to that.
"You could have been killed, you know,"
the man said. Burke remained stoic. The man in the freshly pressed suit went on.
"You need to answer some questions."
"Shouldn't I be represented by my own lawyer?" Burke said smugly.
"That's yet to be determined. Are you a citizen?"
"Yes," Burke responded.
"Can you prove that? You're not carrying any ID."
"Aren't you picking up my accent?"
"Please, you gotta do better than that."
"Can't," Burke said.
"Okay, where are you from?"
The man continued. "That's classified."
"Classified by whom?"
"That's also classified."
"What about your aircraft?"
The man persisted. "Classified," Burke responded.
"So you admit to being on board the unidentified aircraft?"
"The whole operation is classified," Burke said dryly. The man in the suit reclined in his seat. He spent several moments observing Burke, and then he asked another question.
"Okay, what city is your favorite team from? Surely that's not classified."
"Brooklyn," Burke fired back. A small green light embedded in the right lens of the man's thick eyeglasses began to blink. The man placed his index finger against the frame of the glasses and answered the call.
"Yes? Hello, sir. Excuse me?"
The man then rose, turning his back to Burke. He unconsciously drifted toward the two-way mirrored wall, or was it a display panel?
"Sir, I hardly think that's necessary. The aircraft is currently missing." probably destroyed.
He lowered his voice to a whisper that Burke, of course, could still hear.
All we've got is some confused, muddy guy with a vintage parachute. He's probably certifiable.
His exasperated voice rose out of the whisper.
I mean, he's not even wearing any shoes.
Someone on the other end of the transmission was angry. The man in the suit seized. He didn't budge for several seconds as an irate and demanding voice spoke to him through his glasses. Burke used what little slack there was in the chain of the cuffs. He imperceptibly eased his hand forward and ripped a metallic golden stylus from the lawyer's computerized tablet. He palmed it as the man's optotelephonic call abruptly ended. His back still to Burke, the man looked into the singular wall and shrugged his shoulders as though signaling his confusion to someone on the other side. He turned back to Burke and stepped to the table. Without a word, the man in the suit hurriedly gathered his computerized tablet into the attaché and exited the room. Using the metallic stylus, Burke was secretly at work on the cuffs before the clandestine door in the wall closed and sealed itself. It was only seconds before the cuff's mechanism produced an audible click, and Burke was sure his hands were free. He didn't remove the cuffs, however. He knew he was still being observed closely by whoever was behind that mirrored wall. Again, the lights of the room were extinguished, and Burke found himself in total darkness. The painfully pulsating strobe and the low-frequency hum did not return. Still, Burke didn't attempt to fully remove the cuffs and go to work on the shackles. He assumed he was still being observed closely, even in total darkness. The room remained dark for 53 minutes. Burke kept time in his head. Then the bright lights illuminated the room once more. The waves of pain returned at the rear of Burke's head, boring through to his eyes, but with much less ferocity than before. The covert door in the stainless steel wall once again made its distinctive sound. 2 individuals entered the room. Each were hulking men in plain black suits. Burke got ready for them. The 2 men moved immediately to him. One grabbed him by the back of the neck and planted Burke's face hard into the cold steel of the table. The other brute began to remove the shackles at Burke's ankles. When he heard the second of the 2 shackles drop to the floor, Burke slipped the cuffs and reached for a glint of metal under the big man's coat. He was rewarded with a handgun and didn't hesitate. Bang! Burke cracked off a blast that sent a slug through the big man's torso. Burke immediately turned and addressed the other monster with a single bullet to the face. Bam! Crimson gore splattered across several stainless steel walls. Rocked by the loud concussion of the firearm and exposure to the evil strobe, Burke stumbled about the shiny octagonal room, ears ringing. He felt he could account for almost 4 hours and 21 minutes since he deployed. He kept time in his head. Burke staggered to the weird opening in the wall and exited the room. Finding himself in a tight corridor, he was immediately engaged by 2 uniformed soldiers. One of them knocked the gun from Burke's hand by slamming him across the wrist with a truncheon. The other struck Burke in the forehead with the butt of a rifle, knocking him backwards into a wall. Burke's eyes rolled involuntarily. His head spun. Ears ringing, he began to slowly slide toward the floor and unconsciousness. He fought against it. His eyes shot wide open. Springing upward and forward, he launched an attack against both soldiers at once. They were caught off guard in the tight space, and Burke was able to tackle both men to the floor simultaneously. They all struggled. Burke took one of them by the throat while separately driving his thumb deep into the corner of the other's right ocular socket. The eyeball was gouged out with a distasteful popping sound. The cycloptic soldier began flopping about on the floor, wailing for help. Burke continued crushing the other man's trachea until it ultimately collapsed under the force of his grip. A nervous-looking bald man in a white lab coat stepped into the hallway from the room behind the mirrored wall. Gunfire erupted, and a wash of bullets sprayed the wall just above Burke's head. The bald man was amateurishly firing a submachine gun from the hip. Burke retrieved the suffocating soldier's sidearm from a flapped holster and returned fire from the tangle of writhing bodies on the floor. The slug struck the bald man twice in the chest, instantly dropping him. The one-eyed soldier ceased screaming and latched onto Burke from behind. He had Burke in a chokehold and locked it in tight, squeezing hard. Burke struggled to break it, but the injured soldier was more than angry now, and he pulled back on Burke's neck, attempting to kill. Burke placed the muzzle of the handgun behind his own ear and squeezed the trigger. Bam! The crown of the one-eyed soldier's head exploded onto the wall of the corridor, a gruesome mess. The attacker's grip melted away, and Burke collapsed forward, gasping for air. The deafening blast bounced from one side of his head to the other, and he vomited a viscous mix of stomach acids onto the floor. He felt he was again on the verge of passing out, but he had no time for that. He could account for 4 hours and 23 minutes since he deployed. He needed to move. Now. Burke spat and then struggled to his feet as the corridor revolved around him. He used one of the walls as a crutch and staggered along the hallway to the control room behind the mirrored wall. He found it devoid of further threats. His legs were still shaky, but Burke ultimately found his way to an elevator. As he approached it, the doors unexpectedly slid open. Inside, an older gentleman in a white lab coat, unaware, was studying an electronic medical chart. Burke steadied his aim and shot the man once through the head. Moments later, Burke was inside the elevator, which seemed to be ascending eternally. He used the time to relieve the corpse of the white lab coat, putting it on over his mud-smeared jumpsuit. The upper edge of the white coat's rear collar was soaked in bright red blood. Burke found he was again on the verge of unconsciousness as the doors of the elevator opened. He staggered from the elevator car, his head pounding, the environment around him still shaking. He found himself in another hallway, a set of double doors in the near distance. Through a set of small square windows, he could make out the heads and shoulders of people on the other side. He reached back inside the car and pressed a button on the elevator's interior control panel. The elevator doors closed behind him. Burke disengaged the handgun's magazine and released it from the base of the hand grip. 5 rounds remained. He re-engaged the mag and retrieved the slide about halfway. 1 in the chamber. Closing his eyes, Burke took several deep and deliberate breaths before pushing on toward the double doors. He placed the gun at half cock in the right pocket of the lab coat. He hid his cuffed wrist in the other. As he reached the double doors, Burke peeked through one of the small square windows. He observed some nurses chatting at their stations, several medical doctors with stethoscopes around their necks, and some unarmed military personnel moving about at their regular business. A custodian carrying a push broom entered a freight elevator. Burke tried to gather himself. He wiped at his face with his hand, knowing it was mud-smeared, but hoping it wasn't covered in blood. There was nothing to do about his bare feet. Boldly pushing open the double doors, Burke headed directly for the freight elevator. He moved quickly by the nurse's station with both of his hands buried deep in the pockets of the lab coat. Burke arrived at his destination just in time to prevent the doors from closing by thrusting his arm between them. The lonely, loose gun weighed heavily in the pocket of the blood-stained coat. The doors automatically retracted, and he stepped inside and began frantically pressing the closed door button. The doors did close, and he shut his eyes and leaned hard into the wall of the elevator to keep from falling on his face. The custodian with the push broom was there. He said something like,
"Damn, Doc, you look like shit. Where the hell's your shoes?"
Burke didn't respond to that. He was still almost completely deaf. As the freight elevator engaged and began to ascend, Burke stumbled and almost fell. The custodian caught him by the arm and propped him up against the wall. He thought the guy said,
"You're a wreck, son. What did you drink last night?"
Burke couldn't exactly make it out, but he responded nonetheless. "I'm fine."
"You're all kind of messed up."
Burke was pretty sure that's what the guy said, but he still couldn't hear very well. He nodded in the affirmative until the custodian backed off. The elevator came to rest and the doors opened. As the custodian was exiting, he looked at Burke once more. Burke thought the guy said,
"Don't cause me no trouble, man."
Burke couldn't hear everything the man said. He only nodded, confirming again. The custodian reluctantly moved on. Just as the doors were closing again, Burke caught one with his hand and restrained it. The cuffs dangled from his wrist like a pendulum. He took a quick scan of the area outside, obviously a lobby. Pocketing the cuffed hand, he cautiously stepped out. He moved toward the light. Head down, he tried not to stagger as he made his way past the reception desk. Mud-smeared and barefoot, Captain Addison Burke stumbled toward some automatic sliding glass doors and raw alien sunshine. By his estimation, he had only 7 hours and 34 minutes to receive the package, or his mission would be a failure.